Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dimitri Live. I'm Leah Tarachansky. I'm an Israeli-Canadian journalist and filmmaker, and I'm based in Toronto. And I'm joined here, of course, by Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, as you might know already, is a former class action lawsuit lawyer who is now currently running for the Green Party of Canada. He's been a dedicated activist on a number of fronts, including, of course, the environment, justice and peace in Israel and Palestine, and a whole host of other excellent causes. Hi, welcome, Dimitri. How are you?
I'm fantastic, as well as I can be in the circumstances. It's been an increasingly challenging time for all of us, Leah, but I feel, very lucky to be in the position I'm in, which is safe and healthy. And
Yeah.
it's wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to reach out to people through this mechanism. If we'd experienced something like this 30, 40 years ago, we'd kind of all be trapped in our homes, cut off from the outside world other than television set. And I'm happy we're able to at least remain to this extent in touch with our fellow Canadians and others around the world.
I hope you're not dissing the television set, because as a filmmaker and as our guest today later on will be talking about, we rely on the television set. But speaking of how you were spending your time, what's been preoccupying you in these weeks?
Well, all of us are asking about the exit strategy now, and everybody's in a rush to bring this to an end. With each passing day, that whole question of when are we going to have our freedom back? When are we going to have our jobs back? When are we going to be able to interact with our friends and our families again is becoming more and more pressing. And so I
don't know if you saw that we actually had protests here in Toronto at Queen's Park against the closures. Yeah. Yes.
Here in Montreal, I don't think there's been anything like that, but I'm not surprised to hear that Toronto has started to experience some unrest on that front. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to tell. A bunch of people got together on Queen's Park to protest the closures. A lot of people think that COVID is a hoax still, somehow. And then the province's premier, Doug Ford, came on in a press conference yesterday and called them yahoos. So that was interesting.
Yeah, he also said something else, which I thought was remarkable coming from Doug Ford. He said, we're never going to go back to the old normal. Never. That was the word he used. So that was a bit.
Yeah. When people like Doug Ford say stuff like that freaks me out, though.
Me too. Not sure what he means by that.
What do you mean? Yeah, I do not want to live in the world Doug Ford dreams up. Thank you very much. But God help us from that nightmare. But but what is it that you envision? Like, what's one thing, for example, that you see once we go back, or once we start to reopen stage by stage the economy? What is something that you see that is very possible, a very positive opportunity for change?
Well, I think the very first thing we have to do is get people back to work, because this is having a crushing economic impact on so many people. And the struggle that everybody is dealing with, whatever their political inclination may be, is how do we get people back to earning a livelihood at the same time in a way that doesn't pose, enormous risk to individuals and also to the healthcare system. So I think we have to be very focused on how do we ease people back into earning their livelihood. But beyond that, of course, once all of that, some level of economic normality has been restored, we're going to have to grapple with some really difficult questions, big picture questions. First of all, how do we get into this mess to begin with? How did we find ourselves in a pandemic and a crushing shutdown to the economy? And could this have been avoided? Could the impact of this have been at least mitigated to a degree by better preparation? And what kind of a society are we going to build coming out of this that prevents this sort of thing from happening again, or at least it reinforces the ability of our society to deal with this kind of a crisis? And there's going to be some really critical analysis done of the performance of Western governments. What we're seeing right now in a number of states, most notably the United States, which I want to talk about for a minute, is that there's a real tremendous failure of governance, and that the suffering of the population is being increased. The risks to which people are being exposed, especially the most vulnerable members of society are being exacerbated by a grossly incompetent government. In the United States, the Trump administration, recommending that people actually use disinfectant to protect themselves, even potentially injecting themselves with disinfectant. This is coming from the mouth of the president of the United States, you know, and then rushing people into governors from around the country, reopening the economy at a time when the country is experiencing something in the range of 2,000 deaths per day on average. And there's really no end in sight for this crisis in the United States. And you have this Georgia governor who is opening up tattoo parlors, bowling alleys, hair salons, none of which is even remotely an essential business at a time when Georgia hasn't even come close to getting a grip on the crisis. So I think what we're seeing, you know, is a real failure of governance in some states. Canada has mercifully performed, I think, much better on the governance level than a lot of other countries, especially the United States. But we're going to have to do a real sort of sober, intelligent, calm assessment when all of this is over of the ways in which our systems of governance have failed us in this crisis and the ways in which we have to improve them in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening again.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of things in there. You know, I immigrated to Canada from Israel, one of the smallest geographically countries in the world, where maybe it's a feature of Jewish culture, but it seems like everybody knows everybody, to Canada, the second largest country in the world, where you can literally live and not have a neighbor for 100 miles. And this kind of geographic disparity or the geographic distance we have from each other, I found in this country was translated into the way that people saw politics and their involvement and what it means to be a Canadian. And I think that one thing that's very positive that I see that came out of this horrible situation is that, as Gabor Mate said a couple of weeks ago on your show, that we now, without a doubt, have collectively understood that our society means we depend on each other. And one of the really nice positive manifestations of that, I don't know if you have this in Montreal, but here in Toronto, every day at 7:30, people come out on their balconies and on their front porches and they bang together pots and pans, which of course might remind you of the 2012 protests in Quebec, massive protests in Quebec against Bill 78 that attempted to clamp down on protests. So even though here in Toronto, it's not made as a sign of protest, it's made as a sign of solidarity. It is a very interesting thing to see, you know, people who had never talked to each other suddenly exchanging information and supporting each other and showing solidarity. And speaking of solidarity, I just wanted to remind our viewers that whether you're watching us on Facebook or on YouTube, you can comment, you can send questions. In a minute, I'm going to be introducing our guests today who will be joining us. And of course, for any information about the Dimitri Live show, you can go to teamdimitri.ca, where you can read all about the show and also about Dimitri's campaign. Do you wanted to say something before I bring in our guest?
Yeah, a couple of things. You know, I think this experience, and of course, we've seen this not only in Quebec, the phenomenon you described of solidarity and appreciation for our healthcare workers, but it's an international phenomenon, and I think it's causing us to reevaluate, you know, who really are the heroes in our society. There's been a huge tendency in this age of the global war on terror to view people from the military as being sort of the people who are on the front line protecting us. And certainly, you know, they have an important role to play, but the healthcare workers in our society have long been the unsung heroes of every aspect of our society, and they haven't gotten the attention that they deserve. And if anything good comes out of this crisis, I think it's going to be that we're going to have a profound appreciation, not only for the workers, but our healthcare system, nationalized healthcare. You know, in England, it's really interesting that Boris Johnson, of all people, has been talking nonstop about the critical importance of the NHS. And he actually said something which was directly contrary to a famous statement by Margaret Thatcher back in the 80s, who said there's no such thing as a society. Well, Boris Johnson actually said during this crisis, actually, there is a society. And I think this is something that we've all been coming to realize, not just in the UK, but here in Canada, the United States, all across the world. So I think that that's a good thing that's going to emerge from all of this.
Yeah, and of course, the impact on the environment. But right now, we are going to be speaking about the impact on Cuba. So without further ado, we'd like to invite Ed Augustin. He is a journalist who's been living for 7 years in Havana, Cuba. He writes for The Guardian, The New York Times, and Al Jazeera. He also broadcasts for Al Jazeera, France 24, and TRT World. I'm going to show a little bit of his footage here. Ed has made documentaries about Cuba's highly acclaimed hurricane response system, Guantanamo Bay, and the inventive and often bizarre ways in which Cubans use condoms as workarounds for everyday problems. He is currently working on a brand new media platform called Belly of the Beast, which reports on Cuba's unique response to the coronavirus. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us, Ed.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
Great. Do you mind turning your camera? You are sideways.
Okay, good start. Am I upside down or am I the right way around now?
Perfect.
Upside. Yeah, that's right.
You're good, Ed. Thank you.
Yep, okay. Just excellent. Yes.
So Ed, thank you so much for joining the program. And I'd like to start with a sort of basic question. You're on the ground in Cuba, you've been there for a while. What steps has the Cuban government taken to deal with the crisis? I mean, we hear all the time about what's happening in Canada, the United States, Europe, but we don't hear too much about what the Cuban government is doing to deal with this extraordinary situation.
Well, the Cubans initially took a while to act, which is strange because this is a country that's got, I think by a long way, the best public healthcare system in what's called here the third world, global south, whatever you want to call it, developing countries. And I think the reason that they took a little bit of time to act is because economically things are pretty bad here. Especially over the last 2 years, Trump administration's tightened the sanctions an awful lot. And Venezuela, Cuba's main ally, is really under the cosh, and there's tight economic links there. And so Cuba has become highly reliant on, as most Caribbean nations are, on tourism. And I think that was the reason why the government took a little bit of time to take measures. And so speaking to a few doctors here, initially, this is over 2 months ago. So there were mutterings that why haven't they closed the border? Why are flights from China still coming? However, about 2 months ago, that changed. They closed down tourism entirely, closed the border, encouraged all foreigners to go, gave them 3-day windows to go. All foreigners that were left were herded into hotels to isolate them because it was thought that they were higher contagion risks than Cubans. Wearing a face mask in public is not just recommended; it's obligatory, and that's highly enforced by the police. Social distancing measures have been put in and are enforced by the police and army. There's a huge police and army presence here. People aren't scared of it. It's a bit of a pain for those people that want to, go out and throw rubbish out and don't want to get caught without putting a mask on. But while there's a heavy police and army presence, that's not made people scared. But the two standout things that Cuban government has done so far is tracing. Cuba is a country that's got 9 doctors for every 1,000 patients, making it comfortably the country with the highest doctor-to-patient ratio in the world. And they're using not only those doctors, but also medical students and also other students, so university students not even studying medicine. And they've mobilized them and they're having them knocking on doors. Officially it ought to be every day. So every house ought to be knocked on every day. In reality, that's pretty much impossible, and they never got to that. But I've just come back from the neighboring province to Havana, Mayabeque, and in reality, people are having the people in the village I was just at are having a doctor or a student cycle up and visit the house. This is in a rural area where houses are very far away. They're being checked up on once every 2 days. This is a home visit by either a doctor, nurse, or a student. So extreme tracing measures, and they're mobilizing the doctors they've got and the assets they've got, the human resources in society to do that. And the other thing they've done is quarantining. So now anyone that came back into the country after they closed their border, or as the Cubans would say, regulated, who could enter, was forced to go into a so-called isolation center. So old, schools, old army bases, whatever, like state-controlled buildings with bunk beds and food and all of that. And you had to be there for 2 weeks. and I'm British, and I was just talking to my family a couple of days ago, and my dad told me that in the UK, he saw in the paper that every day 15,000 people flying into the UK, and you don't have to go to an isolation centre there. It's recommended that you take measures, but the state doesn't enforce it, whereas they enforce it here. So those two measures, tracing and the isolation centre, which not just show a strong political will, but also show how there's a different relationship in Cuba, but a different weight that's put on not just health, but also the idea of freedoms, right? So it's much criticized from the outside, and many Cubans don't criticize it, but to put it simply and roughly, individual liberties have got less weight on them, the state would put, and collective liberties have got more. So you're quarantined whether you like it or not, to protect the collective. Those characterize the way that Cuba is dealing with this crisis, and the results speak for themselves. So far, there's about 1,400 cases, and just over 50 deaths. Over the last week, you've had about between 60 and 40 new declared cases a day. Comparing that to the UK, of course, it's a bigger country. We've got about, here there are about 2 people dying a day. In the UK, there's about 650 people dying a day. The UK is about 6 times more populous, but you can see that the scale of cases per day and deaths is just very, very different.
So
Ed, I just want to comment on that. Ed, I did my own math before we got it on the program today. I consulted the Johns Hopkins University website, which is the one being quoted most often in the Western press, where the COVID-19 statistics, and adjusted for population, by my calculations, the United States has 171 deaths per million. Canada has 77 deaths per million, and Cuba has 5 deaths per million. And that's an extraordinary discrepancy. I have read, and maybe you can comment on this, that Cuba's in the relatively earlier stages of this crisis. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but still, those are absolutely astonishing discrepancies, and especially for a country that has been subjected for decades to a very punishing sanctions regime. So I'm wondering, is it your sense that Cuba has managed to somehow avoid the worst effects of that sanctions regime in this crisis, or is that actually impacting materially its ability to deal with the pandemic?
Well, to the first point you raised, it's true that it arrived in Cuba later than it arrived in Europe, for instance, but it's been here for the first cases, I think, were towards the end of February. So maybe if we were talking, 5-6 weeks ago, that point about it being earlier would apply. We're well into it now. There are of course other factors. So I think that Cuba, per million people, if you want to level it out for countries, has less people coming into the country than, for example, New York. And there's also some scientific evidence, as we've read, that heat and humidity might slow down transmission, sunlight kill the virus, etc., etc. But nonetheless, even when you take all of those factors into account, it does seem that the Cuban response is that the numbers are so much less that it does seem that it's working, and it's not rocket science why they would be. So I think it's kind of proof that when there's political will to stop this crisis, and the state has got the human capital to do that, and it's willing to deploy them, then coronavirus doesn't have to take off as it has in so many other countries. To the question of the US sanctions, of course the US sanctions complicate Cuba's response to coronavirus. So just 2 examples. There are 2 Swiss companies that produce ventilators. They previously sold medical equipment to Cuba. 2 years ago, they were purchased by a US firm. They can no longer sell to Cuba. even though the embargo or what's known here as the blockade, because it feels more violent and immediate, even though there are provisions in the legal wording of it for medical equipment, so legally they are allowed to sell. In practice, the vast majority of medical companies don't sell to Cuba because the fact it's sanctioned makes it a high risk market. The fact it's sanctioned financially means that Cuba doesn't have the finance, so it's more likely not to be able to pay it. The fact that it's sanctioned means that you might annoy somebody in the United States. So this is an argument, somewhat of a bad faith argument that Trump administration uses, saying that no, this is just a lie, it's a fiction of Cuban government's imagination. Blockade doesn't affect people, but it does. Another example, this happened about 3 weeks ago. A Chinese entrepreneur wanted to send, was sending medical equipment to many countries, including Cuba. This included gloves, this included face masks, this included ventilators, and the freight company that his foundation had chosen to deliver the goods was Colombian, but not North American. So the company took the decision to bail out on delivering to Cuba because, again, of the risks or worried about not being legally in legal compliance with the embargo. And these things are just tip of the iceberg. So Cuba is a poor country; it doesn't have that many ventilators. But the embargo and the sanctions have severely reduced the amount of petrol coming in, make it far more difficult to source anything. So in general, in lots of indirect ways, in multiple indirect ways, some of which we can't even get all the information on, it does complicate not just Cuba's response to coronavirus, but everything. And it's having lived here for 7 years, it's my opinion that the sanctions kill Cubans that would otherwise die because of US sanctions.
I wanted to ask you to please elaborate on that article that you recently published in The Guardian. You write there that last September, with the island running on just 30% of petroleum deliveries, President Miguel Diaz-Canel announced emergency energy-saving measures, and the diesel quotas in the countryside were slashed. You write about the farmers and how that's affected their lives. I was wondering if you can talk about the petroleum shortages and the adaptations Cubans have been making in order to deal with this devastating sanctions.
Yeah, so the petrol shortages are because the Trump administration is stopping petrol being delivered from Venezuela, which is Cuba's main ally, to Cuba. They say that they're doing that because Cuba is meddling in Venezuelan internal affairs, as if the United States, having fomented a coup in Venezuela in 2002 and repeatedly trying to throw the government and currently sanctioning the government, isn't meddling, seems to apply to Cuba, not the United States. And former National Security Advisor John Bolton came out with the false allegation that there were between 20 and 25,000 Cuban security agents propping up, is the word they use, the Maduro regime. It's true that Cuba doesn't want to see Venezuela collapse. It's true that there are Cuban security agents in there collaborating with the Maduro, what I think is fair to call a regime. But it's also true that there are American agents there trying to do it. This is geopolitics. And so that's the pretext they've taken to stop petrol deliveries. And this is a very potent move. The way they're doing it is that they have since April 2019 sanctioned any international tanker company, oil tanker company, and any international and any insurance company that provides insurance to oil tankers that delivers the oil from Venezuela to Cuba. And it's difficult to get the numbers, but just under half of Cuban oil comes from Venezuela. And Cuba pays for that oil primarily through medical services. So you've got about 20,000, it's a huge number, 20,000 doctors and nurses, Cuban doctors and nurses working in Venezuela in historically underserved barrios, popular neighborhoods. And I was there last year and I saw it for myself. So they've stopped a lot of the petrol getting through. They haven't been completely successful. The deliveries still come. And there's another indirect way in which they stop the petrol coming through, which is that the Trump administration is sanctioning PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan state oil company, and they've taken over, expropriated parts of it, and have made it very difficult to get loans. So it's not just they're stopping delivery; they're making production even harder. And of course, I've got no illusions about this. That there's a huge amount of corruption and robbery and ineptitude in PDVSA, but the United States is making a bad situation far worse, and that has consequences for the amount of petrol that Cuba gets, and that has consequences for people's food. It takes food off people's plates. So Cuba, like most countries in Latin America, like every country in the world, is a petrol-based economy. Unfortunately, it'd be good if it wasn't, but it is still primarily petrol-based, and agriculture is very inefficient. It's been an Achilles heel of the Cuban Revolution for the last 60 or so years. Agricultural production in the Caribbean islands in general, most food is imported, and in Cuba, Cuba is also highly dependent. And what it does, I was reporting on this a couple of months ago, and you mentioned the article, is it makes the delivery of seeds less reliable. Right now, tractors across most Cuban provinces are standing idle. I spoke to one guy who normally plants black beans. So in Cuba, like lots of Latin American countries, rice and beans are the staple. You have carbohydrates and proteins, and keep people being able to eat. He normally plants black beans, and he said that he'd just be renting borrowing an ox off a friend and ploughing a very, very small patch just for him and his family. So it has the effect, these oil sanctions, of reducing internal food production, which means that either Cuba's government's got to find more money in this context with an economy that already doesn't work very well, that's sanctioned, the most powerful country in the world, and now tourism, the number two, the second economic sector in the whole country, and that brings in high currency. Either they've got to find more money from somewhere when they've got less than ever to import more food, or more people are going to go hungry. Now, the resistance of the Cubans is worth pointing out, because they've got a food rationing system in the sense that it doesn't limit how much food you can get. When I say rations, it means that it guarantees a minimum that you'll have, and then beyond that, you can buy more on the market. Because of that, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, it's one of the few countries in Latin America that has virtually eliminated hunger. In Mexico, Colombia, in Argentina, there are millions of people who are hungry every day. Sometimes, and even in the UK, there are about 8 million people that are food insecure. It's often hard to believe these stats. At least, when I go back to the UK, I didn't see them, but they're there. And in Cuba, it's not the case. And Cuba is the only country, or I think certainly in the Caribbean, that's eliminated child malnutrition. So that means that every child between 0 and 5 has not just enough calories, but is well nourished. So they've done a terrific job in being able to make sure that there are enough food on people's plates. But these sanctions make it much, much harder. And these days, and for the last decades, the United States says that the reason that the sanctions are there is to bring about democracy and promote human rights. But what we know is that when the embargo was first put on Cuba back in the early 60s, there were private discussions within the National Security Council of the United States, where somebody said, and the minutes are publicly available, that the aim is to bring about hunger so that people would overthrow the government. So that's using food and starvation as a weapon. So we know that in the genesis of the embargo, that was the idea at play. Whether or not that's still in policymakers' minds in the US, only don't know.
Thank you. Now, just wanted to remind our viewers that whether you are watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can comment below, and we would love to include your questions in the interview. Of course, you can also find out more information on teamdimitri.ca, and I'm very happy to say that we have our first audience question. Dimitri, did you want to follow up before we go to the audience questions?
I would like to just touch on the issue of human rights. You raised that, Ed. I read an article that you wrote, which I must say, and I commend you for it. It was a very nuanced and I thought sensitive article, which was published in Al Jazeera shortly after the death of Fidel Castro, and you were talking about the whole question of human rights in Cuba. And you quoted a Cuban sociologist, Juan Valdez Paz. He said, it would be wonderful if the Western media did take a genuine interest in human rights in Cuba, but we know they don't because a real interest would presuppose the same concern for human rights everywhere in the United States and in Saudi Arabia, for example. In reality, this supposed concern for human rights is in large part a political game. And before I ask you my question, I do want to note that during the pandemic, when people in Canada were understandably preoccupied with a healthcare crisis and an economic crisis, the Trudeau government, which claims to be a champion for human rights, announced that it was going to resume the sale of deadly weapons to Saudi Arabia. And within all of that context, and I'm sure we could point to countless other examples of Western government hypocrisy when it comes to human rights, you commented in that article, another perhaps simpler reason why I think foreign media struggle to get a proper handle on the human rights issue could be seen in who came to cover Castro's death. Journalists who are predominantly white, many privately educated, and overwhelmingly from developed, wealthy countries. And you went on to talk about the way in which people from Cuba and other developing countries have a different concept and perhaps a broader concept of human rights. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about that. How do they see human rights? And give us some insight into what the actual human rights situation is in Cuba.
How long you got? Okay, well, I guess I'd start by saying that Cuba is not a paradise. I think if you look at any state, there are human rights violations, and many of the accusations that are leveled by against the Cuban government by human rights organizations, even those that receive funding from murky sources and even the United States, are true. Not all of them are true, but some of them are true. So, for example, there are constraints on freedom of expression. You can't just go on the street and shout down with Raul Castro outside the Capitol building, which is about a kilometer from where I'm speaking to you. There are sometimes political prisoners. Most of them are in Guantanamo Bay, which is controlled by the United States. But even if we don't include that, there are sometimes prisoners. I could go on. But it's my view that the human rights violations that do go on sometimes in Cuba pale in comparison to the human rights violations that happen elsewhere in many countries in Latin America, particularly Central America. So, I've reported in Haiti before. If you're a dissident here, you might get arrested for a few days, a month if you're unlucky, and have a bucket of cold water thrown over you and shouted at. If you're a dissident in Haiti, they might leave your corpse in front of your family's house. That could happen in Mexico. The government, parts of the state continue to disappear dissenters. Colombia, Honduras, El Salvador. You just go down the list of Latin American countries. So for me, the main kind of index I look at for human rights violations is murders, either primarily state-backed murders. And Cuba, that just doesn't happen in Cuba. Doesn't happen since I've been here, 7 years, and it does happen with striking regularity elsewhere. So it's not to say it doesn't happen. It's not to say that there aren't human rights abuses in Cuba. It's to say that the reporting of them, that they're so magnified and decontextualized, because I think Cuba is essentially a country at war. It's a bit sloppy to put it like that, but it is in a fight for its life. The government, or the regime, if you prefer, with the most powerful country in the world, and has been for 60 years. So democracy is the first casualty in war, and I think that context is always missing. So when it's reported on in the international media, these two things are somehow separated. The fact that the United States is sanctioning and threatening, and in previous years trying to assassinate the elected leader, the leader of Cuba, the head of state, is talked about sometimes, but there's never any suggestion that this might impact the way that the Cuban state behaves to those who dissent against it. And on the positive side for human rights, Cuba, you're talking about a wider definition. Often in the Western media, we talk about human rights as the definition is very narrow, and it talks about important things like freedom of assembly and speech, but it doesn't include other things. So, for example, the right to eat, the right to healthcare, the right to have a roof over your head, the right to have electricity that you can afford, the right to have running water, the right to have drinking water, the right to have gas. And in Cuba, there's so many problems, and there's overcrowding. And if you've got a roof over your head, it might well be leaking for a lot of people. But those basics of life are guaranteed. So I think this is, I think judged in the round, Cuba has got an exemplary human rights record. And I think you don't need to be ideological with this. You just need to look at the evidence and just do a straight comparison with other countries. That's before you even get to how many doctors were sending around the world and the millions of lives that's saved over decades. And then, so that's the realities I'd see. And then I contrast that with the media coverage, and the US media coverage and the European media coverage tends to largely take its cue from the State Department. So the State Department, whether it's Trump in the White House or Obama, tends to frame Cuba as a human rights violator. Just 2 days ago, I was collaborating, I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to. I was collaborating with the New York Times on an article about Cuba. Came out on the coronavirus live feed, and the editors just changed what the journalist and I wrote, and they put in that that Cuba's got a bad human rights record, and they put in a line. We were talking about how Cuba sends doctors abroad, and they put in a line saying, well, there are those who say that Cuba sends doctors abroad to deflect attention from its bad human rights record. So it's consistently singled out as this kind of pariah country that's got a bad human rights record, but that just doesn't hold up to evidence. I think when you take a broad view of what human rights are and compare them to other countries in the hemisphere.
Right. Maybe before you ask the question, Leah, I must add this, because it's something that I've been insisting upon in my discussions with people during this campaign. You know, in this country, we have somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people living in the streets on any given night. In the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of people. I don't understand how we don't regard housing as a human right, how we can tolerate homelessness and call ourselves a champion of human rights. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you know, we don't have a section which guarantees housing to our citizens. And I just don't get that. I don't understand it. I don't think that we really have a broad enough conception about human rights in this country. And I think we can learn a lot from the developing world, not just Cuba, but other countries in the developing world who understand the primordial importance to human potential and human dignity, about things like having food to eat, feeding your child, having a home, having access to healthcare. And you know, if anything comes out of this interview, and you've had so much, I think, important to say, Ed, I hope we come to understand that our conception of human rights is a bit too narrow in this country.
Yeah, I go further. I say it's meaningless. Like, I mean, what does democracy? Well, maybe not meaningless, but hugely incoherent. I mean, what does it mean to have a vote if you can't read? What does it mean to have freedom of assembly if you can't eat? I mean, it's so contradictory. It's under like those conceptions of freedom of human rights, you could have no human right violated, but not be in existence because you haven't got food. I mean, it's a ridiculous conception of human rights, and patently like shot through coals. And yeah, like in Cuba, I've been here for 7 years, as I mentioned. I do occasionally see people, you know, that are sleeping on the street. Not very often, much less than in London. And when I have friends coming out to visit me, it's the first thing that hits them. They say, "Wow, I've been here 2 weeks. I've seen less people begging or sleeping rough than I do when I go to get the train to work every day." But so and I make an effort every time I do see someone. I wonder if it's always welcome. But I want to see like what's going on. Why are you here, not there? Why are you out? And every time that I've spoken with someone, they have said that either they've got a house and they like sleeping in the park because it's hot in the summer, or they are from another province, and because of the way that the economy works here, it's very inflexible because it's planned. They don't have their own house or a friend's house to sleep in, but they do have shelters, and they prefer not to just be in the shelters because of whatever personal reason. The food's bad or there are controls there. But the fact is that I've never met anyone here in Cuba that didn't have a place to, and I've made a concerted effort to, every time I see someone, sleeping out or
Yeah,
so
I just wanted to follow up on that because in one of your articles recently, you were talking about the shortages of medical supplies and food. One thing that I'm very leery of as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union is the kind of black and white perception of states that are struggling to implement socialism. And for example, I find a lot of folks on the left here are idolize Cuba, while a lot of folks on the right vilify Cuba. And you lose a lot of the very important, very, very important context, a lot of very important nuance, and also, of course, the things that matter to people's lives. Speaking of, my understanding, Ed, and now you're upside down, is that the population of Cuba, for example, is significantly older than the rest of the continent. And my understanding is that almost 20% of the population is over 60, which of course means a substantial part of the population is at risk of COVID. And online, Yuri has had this question for you. He says that Cuba has been taking he was wondering whether Cuba has been taking particular measures to help out the very elderly population affected by COVID-19. And how does Cuba compare to other countries where a large number of deaths have been elderly patients?
Yeah, it is taking special measures. So Cuba, because of the healthcare system is so good comparatively, and because other factors such as guaranteeing food and having a place to live are better than other Latin American countries. Cuba has the oldest population in Latin America. The life expectancy in Cuba for someone born this year is the same as it is in the United Kingdom. You're statistically likely to live until you're 79. And of course, that creates burdens. It creates you've got a high percentage of economically unproductive, quote unquote, people, and with this pandemic, you've got more people who are exposed to risk. How does Cuba pay special attention to the elderly and other high risk groups? Well, one thing is that they've got family doctors. So these are doctors that live in small kind of flats where they have a consultoria, a consultancy. And it's their job to provide primary care to 1,000 or so people, around 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people on the blocks surrounding them in a city or in the village where they live. And part of what their job is to group everyone into one of four categories. One is, I get the exact names, but one is very, very healthy, two is fairly healthy, three is some risks, and four is high risk. And so the names of the addresses of those people are already compiled so that when a crisis hits, like a dengue epidemic or a coronavirus in this case, they already know who the highest risk groups are, they know what the problems are, they know where they live, and they know they can tend to them. And this is a place where not only healthcare is free at the point of use, but the doctor comes to you. So I was in, as I mentioned before, Mayabeque province, just to the east of Havana, earlier on today. And I was following a medical student and a lifeguard that was with him, because they go in twos, who was cycling this morning to 74 different houses. And he was going to the lower risk groups just to check on people, just to say, make sure you go out with a mask. Have you got a cold? How do you feel? All of that. But the doctor in the village told me that he goes every day to check on the high risk groups himself. So you've got a prioritization of speciality, and I guess that's the primary way in which they are looked after.
Great. I also found it very fascinating as someone who worked covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a journalist, most of it freelance, as well as for the Real News. I found it fascinating you writing about the process of freelance journalism. So just take a step in the direction of your commentary about the way that the media industry functions, which I found your criticisms very, very interesting, and I agreed with a lot of them. Having seen, a whole parade of freelance internationals coming to the Middle East, mostly not speaking any of the local languages. There's a substantial class difference between them and the people they cover. And then they do this thing they call in the industry parachute journalism or conflict hopping, where they go from country to country to country, talk about the number of deaths, talk about who killed who, but don't give any context. And you're quite illuminating in the way that you're discussing that process in Cuba. But speaking of mainstream coverage, we have a question from the audience about the way that Cuba gets covered. So one of the things, for example, you write about is that it's much easier for you to get a gig with an international press if you're covering human rights violations. But it's very hard to cover some of the more, street level reality of Cuba. So recently there was a famous case of a cruise ship that was taken to Cuba, and Jorge Nascimento would like to know what happened with that, because there was almost no international mainstream media coverage of that, whereas I'm sure in Cuba that must have been big news.
Yeah, this is an amazing story. So this is about 2 months ago, at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, just after Trump had cancelled all flights to Europe. It felt here in Cuba, it was 2 or 3 days where really things were changing, and maybe it was the same in Canada, where a wide array of people started realizing, wow, this is big, this is real. And in that context, there hadn't yet been any confirmed cases of coronavirus in Cuba, but people were starting to worry. And there was a cruise ship, British cruise ship, mainly full of British people, but also people from other parts of the world, that was stranded at sea. And it had, I think, about a dozen people, maybe 2 dozen, with confirmed cases of coronavirus. Very scary. So they had no doctor on board. They'd been circling around for over a week in the Caribbean, and they were desperately looking for a place to dock. The Dominican Republic had told them they didn't want to take them. The Bahamas and Barbados told them they didn't want to take them. The United States didn't officially say they didn't want to take them, but neither did they take them. Cuba was the one country that said, okay, let's do this. And I have it confirmed from a British diplomat that Cuba didn't provide. I don't know if there was any payment made, but I do know, confirmed from British diplomat, that Cuba didn't stipulate that payment must be made in order for it. And I think to the extent that if there was any payment made at all, I don't think there's any suggestion that Cuba would profit off this. It would just be covering their expenses, which are quite big for an evacuation operation. So I went there with another, with the person that does the camera for me. And it was very tense, people were worried. And everyone was evacuated from there, but from the ship, and the same night flown back to the United Kingdom on 4 British Airways planes. And I think that says something. I think that says that Cuba is willing to risk its own, to take risks and to do the right thing, because it's the right thing to do, even if it's at a cost to themselves. So right. Everyone who's involved in that evacuation operation had to be going back to quarantine, was quarantined for 2 weeks after that. So the rescue workers there paid a big personal price. All of them came out fine. None of them got coronavirus, thankfully. And that's one example of I mean, if solidarity means anything, it's those kind of things, right? These words are often bandied around, and they're often, in Cuba as well, they're often used as rhetoric. This is like an act of solidarity here, and solidarity for the people, and internationalism. But since coronavirus has hit, I've really been struck by how meaningful the solidarity gestures have been. There's been that, and even bigger than that, I think, has been the quantity of doctors that Cuba's sending out across the world to help fight coronavirus, normally not charging anything, even though Cuba needs the doctors, and even though Cuba's in such a punishing economic position. And yeah, going back to the media coverage, just wasn't covered. It wasn't covered. I was watching on CNN. I tried to avoid it, but sometimes in the hotel I log on. They've got it. They were covering other cruise ships, cruise ship from hell, journey from hell. I was thinking, well, why aren't they covering this? One UK newspaper covered it. I'm sure there's a couple of left-wing organisations that cover it, but it did seem to me to be a very newsworthy story. I mean, it's dramatic. It's there in terms of scale, and there was just media silence about it.
And Ed, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in Canada we actually, in a controversial way, heard about the medical brigades from Cuba. There was a request or a suggestion by certain Indigenous leaders in the Canadian province of Manitoba that Cuban doctors be allowed to come to their reserves in order to help them to cope with the COVID-19 crisis. and the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who was our prior foreign minister, was asked about this by the media and immediately poo-pooed the idea and was pretty much, hostile to the notion of Cuban doctors coming to treat Indigenous peoples, despite the horrific historical treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'm curious if that refusal, it was pretty much amounted to a refusal on the part of a senior official of the Trudeau government. Was that something that got any kind of attention in Cuba? Were the people of Cuba aware that the Canadian government was unsympathetic to doctors from their own country coming here to help Indigenous peoples?
I haven't met anyone, I haven't had that conversation with anyone here. In general, there is less information that gets into Cuba than in many countries on the outside, so to speak, because of the way the media is run and internet access is still lower here than in Canada, for example. But people do know that there's this big PR operation against Cuban doctors, branding them as slaves. That is something that people are aware of.
Well, I think we're nearing the end of our show, Ed. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and we thank you for taking the time out to speak to us from Cuba. We wish you to stay all health and safety in this time, and I hope that we can continue our conversation with you and continue to learn about how the people of Cuba are coping with this crisis. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
Thanks, Dimitri. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks so much, Ed. Dimitri, one thing that I found really fascinating about Cuba's response to COVID, which we didn't have a chance to talk about so much, but I tried to show a little bit of the footage of it, is Cuba's practice, which it shares with a lot of other places like Oaxaca and the Soviet Union, of like consultas, of having people come out to the street corner by corner by corner with doctors and officials, giving out information, answering any questions and all questions that might come from people on the streets, and then taking their concerns back up. And how well that works, of course, I don't know. But I can only imagine a level of that kind of direct democracy being implemented in Canada. And I find it would, Canada, which has a relatively low population compared to its territory, having that kind of community engagement. What do you think are some of the reforms that we could learn from Cuba in terms of democratizing our society here?
Well, I certainly think we should be having a conversation about worker cooperatives. We should be both at a party level and a national level. We should be talking about ways in which citizenry, the ordinary citizenry, not only exercises control but actually has direct input, as you can see in the consultas with elected officials. At the end of the day, we need to be viewing ourselves as elected officials, as spokespersons for the population, and we need to understand that collective decision making, and I cannot stress this enough, collective decision making when the citizenry is making decisions on the basis of information, full and fair information, and that means having a free press, a competent, qualified, and free press. That type of decision making is almost always of superior quality to individual decision making. So when you have one person at the top of a hierarchy making decisions alone with perhaps some input from some hand-picked advisors, that is generally going to lead to inferior decision making to a large collectivity of people who are acting on full information, debating, consulting, and achieving consensus. That is almost always the case. And we have to find ways in Canada to completely reverse this political system we have, which is entirely top-down. And rely upon the citizenry acting, I can't stress this enough, on full information to tell us what the right path forward is.
Right. And I'm also very curious to see, Switzerland has a direct democracy, and I'm very curious to see what their system is like in terms of responding to this crisis. Here I find a lot of the frustration comes from exactly what you're talking about, which is that we get this tiny little window into what those people over there who are making decisions are thinking at a particular moment when they come in front of a very kind of artificial podium and announce their conclusions. And it feels very stifling not be able to ask questions. And speaking of questions, the audience has some questions for you. Yes, so I would like to, again, thank, of course, our audience members for asking these questions, and remind them that if they want to ask you or our future guests any questions, they can do so either on your Facebook page, on teamdimitri.ca, or on YouTube. And Yuri asks, how has the left-leaning media been covering the Green Party race? And do you feel that the press has been giving Trudeau a free pass during this crisis?
So yeah, those are two questions, important questions. The independent media, I must say the independent media has not paid much attention to the Green Party race. And I'm getting the sense, I have to be frank, because I'm a big fan of the independent media. I think it has an absolutely critical role to play in our democracy. But the independent media in this country seems to pay a lot more attention to what the NDP happens to be doing than what the Green Party has been doing. And I think that's true in times of normality, not just, or so-called normality, not just in times of crisis like the one we live in. I think that might also be due, however, to our own, the Green Party itself has not been particularly, my sense, has not been particularly proactive in terms of establishing a rapport with the independent media and ensuring that our message is heard. But it also is true that a lot of people in the independent media in this country have tended to look to the NDP as a source for progressive commentary. And the second question was, Leah, it had to do with whether or not the Green Party contest is being covered by the mainstream media in this crisis. Was that correct? Yeah, no. I mean,
no, whether you feel that the press has been giving Trudeau a free pass during the crisis.
Well, you know, I've watched his press conferences. He's been holding daily press conferences, and actually, I've gotten the sense that they've been asking him a lot of fairly vigorous questions. The questions, though, happen to be of an immediate nature. So, you know, when are we going to open up our economy? Why don't we have enough protective equipment and so forth? There's been very, very little discussion. And I think this is a bit understandable in the current circumstances about the bigger picture of how we got here. And why weren't we prepared for this pandemic? Because I don't think we were. And why weren't these cracks in the social safety net already filled? Why did we find ourselves in a situation where we had to adopt these extraordinary emergency measures to prevent people from falling into poverty? Why didn't we already have a guaranteed basic income? And we're moving in that direction now, thankfully. These big picture questions are not being asked, and it's perhaps understandable. But when we emerge from this crisis, and we will, it is absolutely imperative that all of us, not just the media, but people in politics and the citizenry, ask these very hard questions.
And that takes us perfectly to the next audience question. Matthew would like to know what your, Dimitri, as someone who's running to be the leader of the Green Party, what your position is, if you can expand on your position on income gap. On an income cap.
Income cap. Well, I'm more concerned on wealth caps. So I have two views, but there are a number of ways in which you can address the crisis of inequality. One way is that we should sharply increase marginal tax rates. So, you know, as I've said many times in the course of this campaign already, for much of the post-World War II period, the top marginal tax rate in Canada, the United States, was in excess of 90%. And I think at a bare minimum, the top marginal tax rate in this country should be in excess of 70%, or at least 70%. And there's, I think, broad-based public support for that. So the highest income earners should earn that. But that would slow down the rate of accumulation of wealth, but it wouldn't prevent, in the long run, extreme wealth in this country. So I think we need to supplement that with hard caps on wealth accumulation. Not just because we need additional sources of revenue to deal with the most vulnerable members of society, to deal with the climate emergency, but also because extreme wealth, even in circumstances where the basic needs of every single member of society are being dealt with, extreme wealth is corrosive of democracy. When you have billions of dollars of wealth, you can manipulate the press to your advantage. You can even buy newspapers outright. You can manipulate academic institutions, which are reliant upon private financing for their well-being, in order to pursue an agenda that's favorable to your own agenda. You can manipulate the political class through campaign donations. There's a whole, you can just general advertising. So you can't have a true democratic system in which anybody is allowed to accumulate extreme amounts of wealth, even where the basic needs of the population are being met. So I think we need to have hard limits on wealth accumulation in addition to higher marginal tax rates.
That's fascinating. And if you'd like to know more about Dimitri's campaign, please visit teamdimitri.ca. It's the website that outlines Dimitri's campaign to be the leader of the Green Party. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this fascinating interview with Ed Augustin. Of course, it's very difficult to summarize an entire nation's response to a crisis with one interview. There's so much more to say about Cuba, but please join us next Tuesday for our next episode, where we will tackle a whole other aspect of how this incredible COVID situation has impacted our society. Thank you very much, Dimitri, for joining us on Dimitri Live, and visit us on teamdimitri.ca.
Thank you, Leah. Take care, everybody.